My name is Rob and welcome to Build It TV. On this episode I'm going to be showing you everything I've done on this engine bay so far to hook up the oil cooler lines, power steering lines and the turbo lines as well for the oil and the water supplies to that. If you want to do this on your own RB25 then stay tuned. Also for anyone doing an S-chassis RB25 build, I've actually managed to fit in a viscous fan and coupler in this gap there, which obviously is pretty damn thin, so I'll take a look at that as well. First of all, we're going to start with the oil cooler setup. As you can see, we've got this trussed oil cooler sat in here with two 90 degrees coming off there. The idea is to run our braided hose all the way around here through a gap that sits just about here between the radiator and the metalwork, and then back to where the oil block would be. Now I've actually got nothing on there at the moment because the original RB25DETs come with quite a big sort of cumbersome oil cooler, water to oil cooler setup. So this pumps water through here to help cool down the oil. Now I think this one's actually off an SR, but it looks exactly the same. That unfortunately would be far too big of a block area to where we need, and we don't need the cooler bit there because we're putting in a separate cooler. So we have got this here, which is an RB20 oil block, which doesn't have the cooler, it's just a pedestal that sits it off of the engine. And we've got a Grex ready trussed thermostatic oil sandwich plate. So basically this sits, the oil filter sits onto this. This has got a thermostat in it, so when it opens, it will then open up this core here to allow stuff to go to our oil cooler. Because remember, the goal isn't just to have as cold oil as possible. Oil needs to be at a proper temperature for it to work. So this stabilizes and keeps it at that temperature rather than getting too hot or getting too cold. So the first thing we're going to do is give this a bit of a clean up and see if we can get it to look a bit nicer and ready for the engine. There we go, looks like new. So that coupled with some zinc hardware will look real nice. And this little ready plate will just sit onto the front of it. So I'm going to get that fitted in down underneath the manifold here. Okay, so we've now got our pedestal and our adapter plate in place, and this is where the oil filter will sit here, and there's plenty of room for that to clear, so no problems there. We've got our outlets for the oil cooler pointing towards the front, which is good because that's where the oil cooler is going to be. And we've also got an extra gap here, which is for a sensor or a switch or anything like that. So maybe an oil pressure sensor will go into that one to the ECU. So the next thing to do is to get some adapters on here and make sure we've got it pointing in the right direction for the hose to go, either a 45 or maybe straight out and along this sort of wall here. And then I want to try the air conditioning radiator in here and make sure we don't foul on it when the hoses go through to the front. So we'll pop that in and give that a try. So we've got a nice decent length of -10 line that we're going to use and run that through. So I'm just going to calculate the lengths and we'll open this up and straighten it out a bit. Then we can sort out what lengths we need to run to the front oil cooler all the way down here. So I've measured out what I need on the first hose and I've put some tape around it, so when I cut through the middle of it, it still keeps it all together and doesn't fray. And then we'll pop some ends on and see how that one fits up, and then do the same with the other one. So we've got one end on the cooler and tucked through, and it runs down to here. So what I'm going to do now is just measure up where I want it to sit. So you can see we want it to be in line with the end here of this one, so it fits snug up against that. So really, by the time we've got it in the right angle, we want to cut it about there. So I'll chop this one down, put this end on. Because the end pieces are quite thick, I don't think they'll fit through the hole that we've got over there. So what I'm going to do is loosen the air conditioning radiator and move that to one side while I'm doing this, and then it can go back in afterwards. All right, so we've got our hoses all connected up. We've got the two running to the oil cooler itself, then they go back through the hole next to the air conditioning unit, which is just down here. And there's a nice bit of foam there to keep it all protected, and they run back to our sandwich plate. So that is the oil cooling system all buttoned up. Fantastic. Next up, I'm going to head on to the power steering. So I've already tidied up the reservoir that sits at the top here. So I've blasted it all down, give it a nice coat of a sort of satin black. So the next thing to do is put all the pipework in and also the power steering pump, which sits here, and then route everything around the subframe. So we're going to get this in the air and I'll show you where we're at from underneath. So this is our power steering line that we're going to fit in. If you see those two nozzles there that thread in, we're going to thread those into the two on the steering rack here. Basically they sort of sit the far side of the rack, so it actually runs closer to sort of this side here, and then up, and you can see there is our power steering reservoir. So we're going to have most of the bits going up here, along here, and then over to that side. So after about 10 minutes of trying, it turns out that one is the wrong one for this subframe. That, I think, was the original one off this car or off the other 180. This one is the one that came off the R33, which is what this subframe was originally off of. If you can see, there's quite a lot more to it, and that's because we've got a power steering sort of cooler bar.
Ooh, let me have some of that Cool Whip. What'd you say?
Here, which I'm guessing will sit sort of further up the front here. Now, if we've got space for it, great. If not, then what we'll do is we'll undo this connection here, and just loop that straight across, so it just bypasses all of this nonsense here. So I'll pop it up, have a look, and see what it fits like. Yep, after a quick bit of kerfuffling around, this is definitely not going to work, so we're going to get that bit and loop it around and get rid of this bit. So it turns out this one doesn't fit either. I got a little bit angry with it and sort of just shoved everything in place and just cut it here. Then I went down to my local hose place, and they've made me up this, which has got a compression fitting on the end and a bit of hose to what I've measured. So we're going to trial that up, put the compression fitting on the end of here, and see if that now works. So had to do a bit of custom jobby. It's about 70 quid for the pipe. It might be the most expensive part of the build, but hopefully it'll fit up all perfectly, and we then have power steering complete. You see the compression fitting just there, and we've got the hose just loosely on here, and that will fit on like that. Now, it is right in the way of the turbo, but don't worry, once we've got it on, we can do a bit of flexibility and move it out of the way and have room for our inlet pipe to come here. So, other than a couple of hose clips that are going to go here, and around places, that is our power steering all buttoned up and good to go. So moving on to what's probably been the biggest headache of this build so far, which is the radiator. I've always wanted to keep the original air conditioning core, and that seems to be a bit of a struggle because most people go for a rad that tucks underneath here, like I have on the other 180. But for this one, I really want to keep it all looking OE with the air con. I'm going to have an aftermarket radiator, which is this Apex Racing one, and we've been short for room between the radiator and the water pump. I'll show you what I mean. You've literally got not a lot of room there. So the first thing I tried was the RB viscous coupling, but that's sat way too tall. And if you could see, the SR1 is quite a bit shorter. So thought I'd try that in, and well, as you can see, it's nowhere near in size. You're absolutely miles off from trying to do it. Just so happened I was working on my Datsun the other day, putting a new water pump on it, and I noticed that the mounting points looked exactly the same. So I thought, well, I'll just have a look and measure up the Datsun viscous fan to the others and just see how it sits. And it is, as you can see, shorter again. So took that and fit it in, and it won't do it with the radiator in place, but if you take the radiator out, put it on, and then put the radiator in, it does work, which is fine, but then you can't put the fan on. So I looked at the fan fitting, and with the fan, which is our GK Tech fan here for higher flow, at the front here, well, you lose all that extra room that you've gained. But I noticed that the threads go through, and you could potentially fit it on the back. So like this. So what I had to do was grind out these areas here so it would fit nice and flush, and then bolts through here to hold it in place. And it works. So I've got nothing to hold the radiator at the moment, but with it sat back, you can see there is clearance between our radiator and our viscous fan, and there's clearance on the fan for the cam cover, so that's good. The only thing we might have an issue with is, if you see here, it's pretty close to the power steering belt, although that sits more up like that, and a little bit close down to the bottom pulley as well. So gonna have to have a look at that in a bit, but for the moment I'm pretty happy we've managed to get that far. And the parts came from a Nissan source as well, so you could still buy new the Datsun 280 stuff, but I find it very strange that they're using 50-year-old parts still on a lot of modern cars, because that fitted straight up. The bolt pattern was the same for the water pump, the bolt pattern for the fan was exactly the same. I just need to adjust it a little bit to have the clearance. We'll of course be running a fan shroud. The one I'm going to be running is off an R34 Skyline. I'm just waiting for that to arrive, but that should fit in nice and snugly. I was up here yesterday just bashing out some work on this, only a few little things like painting up the radiator brackets, putting new hardware in, and I also finished off plumbing up the fuel rail, which plumbs down to the pressure regulator, which goes down here and then goes back to the return line. So next up I want to tackle the turbo, and that has an oil input and drain, and also the water input and drain as well. So it's a HKS turbo which runs a Garrett core, and you've got the oil which comes in the top here and drains just gravity fed back down to the block, and then you've got the water which passes through the central part here and feeds back into the coolant system. So to do all that, I just bought this universal kit, available off eBay. It's got all the fittings and everything you need specifically for any low mount RB that runs a 3076R, and hopefully these all fit. So what I'm going to do first of all to make this a bit easier is pop the turbo off, just so we can put things like the oil drain on there and gives us a bit more room for all the lines as well. So with the turbo off, I've then fitted the return line, which is this little piece back here, and it runs down on a hose down to this fitting here. So this is your oil return, and that will eventually take it back down into the sump. If you can see, there's another one here. That's my breather from the back of the head. There's an oil drain breather that I've run. That's the Franklin Performance one. I just need to shorten the pipe that's running down to that. But the one from the turbo is going to end up here. And our turbo supply is going to come from just above it. There's this one here. So you've got a threaded bit there, and that will allow me to thread in this one here that goes on the end of this feed here, and that one is then our turbo supply for oil. So that is our supply on our return sorted. The next bit to do is the water jackets. Now when you've got the turbo mounted, best thing to do is have the water going uphill on the turbo. So if your turbo is not level and the inlet and the outlet are separate from each other, the higher one should be the return, and that one, so if you look back here, you've got the sort of bolt, which is when you're doing a conversion from a non-turbo, you can use that as the return. But above it here, we've got our return, which is the factory one, and we're going to plumb into that with one of the larger pipes here. So that'll be our water return. Our water supply is actually going to come from the other side of the engine. So we've got this one here, which is going to bolt to the turbo this end, and then we've got a hose joint here, which will feed around the back of the engine, underneath the inlet, and hook into some of the pipes that go to the coolant system under there. As we haven't tackled that side yet, I'm just going to run the pipe round, but that is the feed for the water. So we have turbo with water supply, oil feed restrictor. That's a restrictor in there to make sure there isn't too much oil getting in, because you can actually really damage the turbo by putting too much oil through it. And then we've got the return, which is going to go down to that bottom sump mounting. On the car, I've mounted the oil supply up already, and I've mounted the water return, which is this one, just so you can see that plumbed in. That's back there. And I'm going to leave those two on the car and these two on the turbo, so that when we pop it in place, it's a bit easier to maneuver around. Also, this is just going to have to come off again, because before this whole thing does start up, I'm going to drop the engine out. I'll probably do it off camera and tidy up the whole engine bay and do some other bits as well that I want to do on the engine. And then everything will go back in, oils, fluids, and ready to go. But this is really the mock-up to make sure everything fits properly. So I'm going to put the turbo in place, and we'll just match up all of the feeds and sort of returns just to make sure everything sits in the right place. Okay, so that's everything from the top side. On the water return, I've just ran that water feed around the side here just so it's running in the right direction. We'll get something to actually sit it up against the bulkhead at some point, or maybe attach it to sort of here somewhere. There's a bit there we can do. So the last thing to do is put the return down to feed back into the sump. So we're going to put the car up in the air and connect that up. So I put the return pipe on. I actually had to trim it down a little bit. I had to cut off just like less than an inch of it, just otherwise it was kinking in the middle here. But that will work really nicely. You can see the rest of the pipes there as well. I'm not 100% on the way that one is pointed, the oil feed, but you can't really point it downwards because of the way the block is formed. So I'm not really quite sure what to do there. I'll have a little bit of a Google, but I think that'll be fine because that's pressurized. So the ones I mentioned at the beginning, we managed to do the oil cooler lines, the power steering lines, and the turbo lines. So progress, definitely. More to come on the next one. We'll be doing some aluminium welding on the intercooler pipes and things like that. So stay tuned for that. But right now, one more thing I want to try, and that is that this turbo came with a couple of cool parts. One was the matching downpipe elbow that sits there, which I really like. The other was this HKS heat shield. So I haven't actually seen it with it on, with all the cam cover and everything there. So let's just feed that down there. We'll just sit this in place, and that will sit something like that. It's that. Shit hell. Amazing, just stood on a bulb. Genius. Get those out of the way. That looks awesome. Yeah, loving that. Like I said, all this has to come back apart. That's why it hasn't got the fastener clips in there and the gasket, because we're going to take all this back out when we clean up the engine bay. But that will definitely do for now. That looks brilliant. Nice. Thanks for watching, guys, especially if you made it this far in the video. Appreciate any support that we get, and if you enjoyed any of the content or it was helpful for you, then please hit the like button and think about subscribing. And follow us on social media. It's Build It TV on Facebook and Rob Build It on Instagram, or the Build It Instagram page as well. All the links to the videos go up there first thing, and any support and shares that you can give those, I always appreciate. See you soon. Catch you later.